Hi everybody, welcome to another painting tutorial from Promethean Paints. Today I'm going to be focusing on the Ork Bannernob, but mostly around the blue flesh, the leather, and then at the very end just how we do some of the rust effects. A large number of the other parts can be found in my other tutorials for the orcs, so I thought I'd save a little bit of time and focus on the bits that make this model stand out from the other orcs we've painted. So as a push-fit model from the Armageddon box set, I have built it completely and then stuck them on this little base. So for the blue flesh, we're just going to be using some colours you might not be thinking about. So we've got AK Oxford, some Vallejo blue violet, then some AK grey blue, and then some Vamperic Flesh from AK. So what we're going to be creating first is a mix, probably 50-50 mix of the AK Oxford and the Vallejo blue violet, and then adding a little bit of water. And this is creating really our darkest colour and the colour we're going to use to base coat all of the flesh. It may take a couple of coats. It is thinned down with water. The Oxford blue colour is quite thick, but the blue violet from Vallejo is quite thin, and can just quite thin your mix down quite a bit, especially with the water as well. So you may just need a couple of coats to paint our little orcish friend, but that's fine. A couple of thin coats is better than one thick coat. A big thick coat can clog up all of the lovely detail that we've got on this miniature. So a couple of thin coats is fine, and just work around on this orc or any other orcs you're thinking of painting. Base coat it in that mid-tone that we've created. So once you're happy with your base coat, we're now going to create from that base coating that we've done. I've added a little bit more water to it, and now we're going to move on to our grey blue, and this is where wet palettes come in very handy. I've taken a little dab of that, and now I'm creating a sort of mid-tone between the base coat that we created and the grey blue, and this is our first highlight layer. And the idea here is really to cover a majority of the flesh, but leave that original colour in all of the recesses. Definitely on the face, make sure you pick out the lips, the chin, the eyes, the cheeks, the eyebrows, the ears. On the hands, you pick out the knuckles, basically all the raised areas at the moment, but particular focus on those bits that our eyes are drawn to around the face. But yeah, we're probably covering 90% of the skin now in this new mid-tone that we have created. Don't be afraid to start adding texture as well, and you can do that by painting in straight lines across the muscles, like the striations you sometimes see on the muscles. So working the paint towards the center of where you want it to be brighter, because as the rule we've always mentioned on these videos is where you leave your brush is where the most where the most paint is going to be left. So when you work, if you've got a highlight in the middle or towards an edge, you just pull the paint down towards that area, and then when you remove your brush, the most paint is going to be left. If you're starting to get some quite harsh blends on big flat areas, you can always water the paint down a little bit more to create a subtle glaze, and then you can just glaze it in from the dark edges into the center of those points. Okay, already you can see it's starting to get some good definition. So once again, just thinning that paint down a little bit with a bit more water, and I'm just adding in a little bit more of the grey blue now, and a little touch of the Vamperic Flesh, just to brighten it up a tad. Then always a bit of water here. We're creating a sort of heavy glaze here, so the paint is nice and translucent, but not too runny that it just pools everywhere, so it's not quite a wash. And originally I was using a size 1 Raphael 8404 brush, but now I've gone down to a size 0. Just because the brushes seem quite big, it's the point really is the point of the brush, the very tip. Just because the brush is very, very small doesn't mean it's got a nice sharp point. Sometimes I find the size 1s and size 0 brushes have the best sharp points, especially on these 8404s. So now, yep, we're just going back over now, but this is really creating our first highlight. So we've done a couple of layers and now we're doing highlights. So we're focusing on those raised areas. And as you can see, I'm pulling that paint down to where I want that highlight to be brighter. And as I mentioned, picking out cheeks and around the chin and the tops of the ears, the tops of the muscles. This is where you start adding definition to those, the shapes that have been sculpted onto the miniature. Adding striation lines to the muscles, picking out the knuckles. Yeah, this is where we start to really define the bright points of the skin and giving our orky friend a bit of character. So now we're going to go even brighter. So I just start a fresh little pool of paint, which is relatively probably a 70-30 mix of the grey blue with the Vamperic Flesh, and add a bit of water. Now again, we're just adding our secondary highlights, and this is very small and very subtle, only over the most raised areas, focusing heavily on the face, just so that, because our eyes are drawn when we look at a miniature, our eyes are drawn to the face and the weapons. So if we get some nice definition on those areas, and especially where the skin is really quite heavily taut, we can start defining the shapes. And we've defined the shapes now. Now we're just adding tiny little highlights to those. As you can see, working in lines, not necessarily nice flat smooth movements of the brush. When you add these little lines, our eyes can pick out these little bits of texture. They add different bits of definition. Don't worry at this stage if it's getting really bright. We are going to be toning it down in a minute with a couple of little glazes, just to add some odd colours and some more character to the flesh. So the next step is I'm just going to be adding a pinkish red wash to some of the areas of the skin in the recesses. And for that I use AK Wine Red. You could use Carroburg Crimson or Volupus Pink from the Warhammer range. But whatever you use out of those three colours, thin it down heavily. That's one little drop of paint to many, many drops of water. It doesn't matter even if you over thin this, you can always add more layers. It's better to have it overly thinned than under. If it's over thinned, you add more layers. If it's under thinned, you can create nasty effects which you then have to paint over. But what I'm doing here is, as a glaze or a wash, I'm just pushing the paint down or up into the recesses just to create just some colour tone on our skin, make the skin look a bit sore and stretched, adds a bit more life into those recesses that we've created through paint. I wanted to get a slight purplish hue to the recesses, so I'm just going to use some contrast Luxium purple, a few drops of water into this as well, so I've created almost like a purple wash. And I'm just painting this into some of the darkest, deepest recesses, just to tone it down a little bit and add just some subtlety of colour. This step is optional, you don't necessarily have to do this, you could be happy with the red finish that we've got, but I just did this to add a little bit more definition. And now we're at a stage of refinement. This is where we're working on the fly. We're looking at the model, we're looking at our recesses, we're looking at the shadows we've created, we're looking at the highlights we've created. Now that we've done a few washes, this is our opportunity to bring back some of the highlights where they might have dulled. So here I'm just picking out the eyes and I go around and just work now just to bring back some tone, knock some tone back. This is all personal preference now. There might be some vein details that we want to add in onto the skin. I'm adding in some scratches there and some blemishes just on those flatter areas, just to bring a bit of texture and life into it. And this is where the wet palette is particularly useful, because those colours that we've used, even in the heat at the moment that we've got in the UK, even in the heat they stay relatively wet, but can also be referenced back to recreate them if you need to. So just for the mouth, there's some gum line and definition around his teeth. So I've just made a slightly thicker wash of the wine red, and I'm just going to paint the inside of his mouth in that wine red colour, just so that it pulls really around the teeth and the bottom of the teeth. We can paint back in the teeth, but this is really just getting some colour on the gums and the lips. And that's really the last stage of the blue flesh. Relatively straightforward to do, using colours you might not think of. And again, you can use this across all the Ork range. Works really well on Chaos Demons. So I'm going to try a slightly different look to some of the leather. There's quite a lot of leather on this miniature, and I wanted to have a reddish leather for some parts, almost humany type leather looking, and then normal type leather looking on some other parts. So the first colour, what we're doing is we're going to be basing anywhere where we want this reddish pinkish type leather with AK burnt red, corn red, if you were looking in the Warhammer range, will do just as well here. And then we're going to do our first layering with Bordeaux red from AK. Very deep, rich, reddish colour, but when we start brightening it up, it's got this nice humany pink look to it. So for this flesh on the Bannernob, I've done the sort of little tassels at the bottom, some straps, the straps of the flagpole as well, picked out in this colour. But you could do all of the leather in this. I find sometimes when there's lots of leathers, to break it up a little bit just adds a little bit more character to the model. So now we're going to add our first highlight and layer, really, which is with that Bordeaux red. As you can see, it's a very pinkish red. It's an odd little colour, but works really well. So this is where I'm going to be adding a highlight. So that's an edge highlight across all of it. And as you can see now, I'm adding lines of paint in line with what they've sculpted on the miniature, but trying to leave that black red in the deepest recesses and around any rivet holes or spikes. Just leave that black red around, a little tiny bit around that area. It saves you then having to go back and do a wash a bit later on. You can do when you're doing your finishing touches, but it saves a job. So here it's using the methods that we've used before, pulling the paint down towards where you want your highlight to be, adding texture by doing straight lines and spots and stabs with the brush, but just go around really covering, I would say, 90% of that black red that we've laid down. So now we want to do our first proper highlight. And a good way of doing your highlighting, especially if you want to add a bit of, make it look worn, especially leather, a worn highlight, it looks really good. And to do that, you just add desaturated colours. So a desaturated colour is the Vamperic Flesh that we previously used. So here again, it's another edge highlight, but quite a thin edge highlight. And now all I'm doing is picking out the sculpted damage and that's been put onto it, but having a nice crisp edge highlight around these parts, a few scrapes and scratches here and there, just add some shape and definition to our pinkish red leather. For the other leather parts, we're going to base coat all of those in AK Afro Shadow. If you're using Warhammer paints, I would probably use Rhinox Hide, is a good counterpart to this colour. There's quite a lot of leather now. There's the gun pouch, his little vest, the strap for his gun. Yeah, quite a bit here. I also, on that previous leather colour, I did the strap for the axe and the flag in that colour as well. There's also the tassels on the rope, but this is our bulk leather now. So try and take your time. So you base coat all of the leather. Try not to get anything over some of the other previous areas that you've painted. When it comes to these bullet holders, I try and leave a little bit of the black in the deepest part of the recess. So I'm always wet dry brushing over the top of those parts. Again, it saves having to do a wash again. But if you do paint in those, you want to darken it down. Just a little bit of Nuln Oil or Agrax Earth shade in there will help tone it down. So now we're just going to layer up to get a bit brighter. Oh no, but first, sorry, jumping ahead of myself here. Sometimes as you're going around painting these models, you do notice some bits of leather here and there that still need to be picked out. Look inside his arm guards there. Okay, so our first layering will be with AK Beast Brown. Now this again will be covering 90% of the leather that we've just done. You could go straight in with Beast Brown and then use like some Agrax Earthshade brown wash, any dark wash, to tone it all down and give you darkness in the recesses. But I find that the Beast Brown is quite a thin paint and may take a couple of layers to cover properly, whereas the original brown we used it's good. It just takes one coat of paint, so it acts as a good shadow color and base for the Beast Brown. So really all we're doing here is we're leaving tiny bits of the Afro shadow in the recesses, and where any leather overlaps you leave a little bit in those gaps as well. And we're just really now just layering on our first main layer of Beast Brown. Now we're moving on to highlighting. Our first highlight is with AK Cork, a fleshy brown colour. So here is primarily an edge highlight, and we're picking out all of the fine details that have been sculpted onto the model. So any scratches, blemishes, holes, you highlight around those, but the main goal here is the edge highlight and picking out all of the raised areas. So it's like it's almost an edge highlight on an edge highlight in some of these cases where there's edges on the leather that need to be picked out. You may have noticed as well, for those eagle eyes, on flatter areas of leather, like on the back part of his shoulders, I watered down the beast brown and kind of stippled the paint onto those parts. So when there are large areas of leather, watering it down and stippling it on gives a really good worn effect. The paint will pool in weird bits and spots, and it's a good way of doing large areas of leather very, very quickly. So here, where it's watered down a bit, it does go on quite bright, but it will dry back. So our final highlight colour, this is very sparsely used, is a fleshy colour. For this one I'm using Kislev Flesh, and this is a very, very small highlight, very, very subtle. Don't need this in many places, but this is just to add our desaturated worn look. So I just add this where the leather would be most stretched or most worn, in line with where it is. But yeah, so just a small edge highlight around those bits, and then pick out any finer details you want. And with that, pretty much your leather is done. You can use it across your entire range quite easily. So now we're going to jump into the future, where I've finished painting off the model using all the techniques that are in the other Ork videos that I've posted for the Weird Boy and the Big Boss. And we're going to go on to our weathering. So from this point, the model was finished. I was happy with the finish on the Bannernob, and now I wanted to add all of my weathering. So I used 3 primary colours for my weathering, and I found these are tried, tested and true for me. And I know a number of other painters use them. They're really good colours. They do exactly what they say on the tin. So that's AK Dark Rust, AK Medium Rust, and AK Light Rust. You couldn't get any more plainer on their use. Now, I do use them in some non-metallic metal recipes, but for me, their real power is creating these rust effects. So what I do first off, each one's, I've got my little pot palette there. I create washes of each one for dark red, one for the dark, one for medium, one for light. Thin down, it's probably a 70-30 thinning in favour of water. Doesn't matter if you over thin them, you can add more layers. And here I'm just adding in, not haphazardly, there is a bit of thought to it, but really where I want my rust to be, and I start off with that darker colour. You could start off just with medium and then go to light, but I just wanted to show you how you can go from the dark to medium to light to get some good build up. If you want something to look extremely rusty, then you can base coat it in a hull red, like AK hull red. I know a number of manufacturers do a hull red colour, so that would be like a corn red, like a very dark red in the Warhammer range. But the hull red axe I find is a really, really good starting point. So yeah, if you wanted something to look completely rusted out, then yeah, base coating it in AK hull red would be the way to go. But I didn't have that on this miniature, just starting really from the metals. This works really well as if you've done dry brushing metals as well, these rust effects. So yeah, basically, really in a nutshell is, with the areas you want to be rusty, you just go over and layer it up with some of the thinned down dark rust. Once that's dry, you then go over a smaller area of what you've just done with the medium rust, and then once that's dry, an even smaller area with the light rust. Now the light rust I use on just those bits that I want to look newish rust, more heavily worn rust. Then once you've done that, there's one final little trick that we can do, and we'll chat about that when we get there. So once it's all dry and you're happy, always, before you move on, always wait for it to fully dry, because it will dry a bit darker. So just give it a bit of time. So once you're happy with the effect, then our last weathering effect, we use some AK Fluorescent Orange, very, very sparingly. And I just add this into some tiny spots where I want the most rust to have pulled. And this then finishes off our little weathering effect that we've created. I find it's a really nice way to intensify that newish filth rust that we've created, especially with orcs on the weapons. It works really well. So what you've done with your washes there is create some nice base rust all the way up to fresh wet rust, and those rust effects can be used across your entire modelling range from 40k to Sigma, everything, and bolt action, really good wash effects. And as I said, if you want to learn how to do the metals that I do, some of the other bits and bobs that we didn't cover on this, then we've got the Big Boss tutorial, and there will be a Pain Boy tutorial and a Weird Boy tutorial. I will be doing a separate one about doing transfers, because I understand some people struggle with them a little bit, but I'll put a video out about doing those. And there we have him, the Ork Bannernob, all finished off. Great character model. I think even if he was completely useless on the battlefield, I'd still run one, because they look awesome. So yeah, I hope you've enjoyed the tutorial. I hope you can use that blue flesh across some other orcs, especially on the characters. I think it works really well. As always, like, comment, and subscribe, drop a comment, all that kind of stuff. Really appreciate the feedback. I'm a commission painter as well, so if you're interested in getting anything painted up, just drop me a message and I'll see what I can do for you. And yeah, happy painting, my little orcish friends.